Welcome to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today I'm with Paolo Chikiamco, and we are talking about Mythspace. Mythspace. So, Paolo,
Is
why do you love
happy to.
comics?
Um, I love comics. I've loved them for a long time. They were one of the bribes my mother used to use so that I could actually follow her instructions. Uh, I don't think I would have learned to sleep by myself in a room if I was bribed with comics. Although I don't know when that transitioned into just me pretending so I could get more comics. But yeah, it's always been something I've looked forward to. I think that the first comic I remember was like this Avengers comic that had Spider-Man in it, and it was like blew my mind. Spider-Man in an Avengers comic. I think they were in space fighting the Stranger or something. Like that's my first memory of a comic. But I think what really got to me was the point where I eventually discovered Arnold Arias mythology class, like in the 90s.
Mm,
And I don't I mean this was not
that's a big
the
one.
compilation. This is my pride and joy. Like I still have these like their floppy things that they used to sell. Like 'cause they came out originally this way, right? This huge um individual issues, and I was blown away. I'd always been a child of fantasy and speculative fiction and comics, but for the entirety of my youth, most of the stories that were in those genres were from the West. This was even before anime and manga were big here, so it was just like Tolkien stuff or David Eddings. These were the stories that were available in the bookstores, and I had no idea. Well, I didn't know much about local folklore or mythology at the time either, and to see that paired with a Filipino creator being sold in the comic shops, and it opened my eyes to the possibility that there were people around me who were doing this kind of work, who liked the same kind of stories that I did, but were doing it here and doing it using Filipino characters, a Philippine setting, Filipino culture. And while I didn't think about making a career of it until much later on, this was the first time I realized it was possible. Um, and comics has always been near and dear to me for that reason, and partly because as I grew older, I could see the strengths it had. I always liked stories that can layer upon themselves,
Yeah.
and because comics are a medium that inherently involves like just juxtaposing pictures and the words and the layout and the panels. There are so many layers with which you can tell a story with a comic in a much more efficient way than if you try to replicate that in another medium.
Hmm.
And another thing I've always liked about it is that the pace is reader controlled. So like sometimes you're watching a movie and you wish you could linger on a particular scene, or you miss something and you're like, oh wait, what was that? With the comics, you don't have that, right? You can, if you come across a particularly striking page, you can stay there all day if you want. You can take as much time to absorb it as you need to. I remember there's this manga, A Bride Story, Karumari, and there in the first book, that the first volume I had of it, there was a scene where this kid gets to visit like a wood craftsman. So this guy carving a piece of wood, and the art was just it was so intricate. And then I just stopped and I just stared at it for a long time because it was just blown away by the artistry of it. And that's not something that's possible really in, I mean, sure, you could pause a movie, but it's not the same. Like there's no pressure with a comic to rush to the next part. It's you're allowed to take it at its own pace. And I've always appreciated that. So those two things primarily, I think, are what attracted me to reading comics. To when it comes to making them, I'd have to add the fact that it's a collaborative process. I can't draw very well. Pretty early on, I used to try, but early on, I sort of realized I'd have to specialize if I was going to get anywhere. And I think that part of the joy of comics has always been collaborating with somebody else,
Yeah.
being able to bring entirely different skill set to the table and yet unite them towards a common goal. One of the things I try hard to do with when I'm working with an artist is I always try to because usually I'm the one that does the press because while my artists have grown thicker skin through the years through all our conventions, they're still not as comfortable in the spotlight. But I always try to make a point that they're we're co-creators. It isn't one of those, writers get top billing situations. Like even if I wrote every story in Mythspace, I mean, when we get co-creator billing, it's just all of us together. Um, we have like Koi is the lead artist there, primarily because his story in Mythspace is the one that specifically continues and that ties everything together, moving forward. But um, all of us who contributed to that, especially all of us who were originally part of the team, we would talk about these things as a group. We would generate the ideas as a group, and it's always like even if an artist doesn't verbalize it, when they put the design on the page, that's already world building. You can already there's already so much to go on just by what they choose to include and not include, and that's always been the beauty of it for me, and that's why I enjoy making comics so
With the exception of Arnold Arre, who would you say are your biggest influences when it comes to making comics?
much. Um, I think that well, I think that I learned writing comics from like I tried my best to study it from specific people. Like one of the first comics manuals, I guess you could call it, that I read was the writing the really thin writing manual of Alan Moore.
I knew it.
Uh,
I knew it. That was
right?
gonna be my first guess.
Yeah. There's not a lot
Yeah.
available for specifically for writers. I mean, I read the How to Draw Marvel way things, but they're very
They're for artists.
specific. Yeah. And so these kinds, I mean, that's I mean I haven't read as much of his comics work as others, but in that sense he was my first teacher. So I came into it trying to learn things from, I mean, I'd read a lot of comics, but I usually when I decided I wanted to write them, I went to the textbook stuff. So understanding comics, making
Yeah.
comics, that sort of thing. Um, a lot of what I learned about layouts and paneling, I learned in general from shonen manga that I
Really?
sort of grew up with. Also, in that sense, that they are um, not really Naruto or anything. We were a bit older for that, but like I've always been a manga reader as well, and like I've always tried to sort of like when I try to do a comic, I one of the things I try to restrain myself from is putting too many words on the page, because that as a someone who was primarily trained in prose writing, that's I know that that's something that I have to work on, and manga is a good sort of solution to that, because there's a lot of manga where the focus is really on the art and giving the pages room to breathe. They're much more sparse with like exposition, um, and I
And that's
try to
Japan,
learn
right?
from that.
That's Japan art and literature in general, right? Like this,
Mm-hmm.
the use of negative space and
Right,
yeah.
right. So I try to learn how to adapt some of those things when we're doing comics, like when we're doing like if it's an important scene, I have to think about, like, do I want to say this element out loud? Do I want to just show it? Do I want to just have it off screen? And those things, I try to sort of meld my experience with more Western type comics and manga. So in that sense, those are my influences there. The trying to sort of mix them together. Um, I have to say that I have to mention Bujet and Kajo, because of how they were. I mean, when the first Comic Cons, I was there, I think, in the first Comic Con, and that that's where I met him, just as some customer buying Trese, and it was also important because I got to see, because they were doing something that I wouldn't say nobody else was doing at the time, but at a level that was already beyond what others were doing in the similar space. So I learned from that too. I've talked with Budget a lot over the years since, especially when we were working together on Quintillion. So I've learned a lot from him, and he's been always been a huge help and usually supportive of whatever we did. Um, yeah, I think those. I mean, those would be, I guess, my main influences. I get inspired by a lot of local creators who don't really influence me because simply because the style is different from what I'm going for. Manix is
Yeah.
once in a generation genius.
Yeah,
Hopefully,
absolutely.
when the books from Ablaze comes out, that will also expose him to a more international audience. But I don't think. I mean, for me, it's still Kiku Machine is still just it's amazing.
Yeah.
Um, and that's not something that would translate. But like if you live here and you read Kiku Machine, you know that this guy is a genius. Um,
I
yeah,
think
so
there I think this is something I've been toying with a lot. Like there are certain artists and writers. This has nothing to do. This is not a commentary on anyone's greatness, but there are certain artists and writers where you can replicate them. Like I think somebody like Neil Gaiman, you can get somebody with some skill and to kind of replicate a Neil Gaiman script, and it'll come out coming close to a Neil Gaiman script. It won't be quite as good, but you can kind of get maybe 90% there.
right,
But then if you have somebody like Mannix, that's it. No one's replicating that at
right,
all.
right. I think part of it is like it's just the way, like with someone like Gaiman, like he or he structures his thought in a way that is replicable.
Yes.
So it's not like it's any less in terms of quality, but the way he thinks is more replicable than like when Mannix talks, the insights he would have to a situation are just like you'll look at the same thing, and then like his observation will be completely like, huh? I mean, it'll be true, but it's like how did your mind even go there? So yeah, so Mannix inspiration, Emiliana Campilan, Dead Balagtas is what she goes by, is again, I think I would place her almost at the same level, and she at terms of like her ability to portray something on the page, she's amazing. Um, and so I mean, we are. I think this is. I mean, I don't have as much. I don't think I'm the best person to compare. I'm not really comparing, but I'm not. I don't have as much nostalgia for the bygone comics days as
Yeah.
other people do. Since I didn't, they were by the time we were growing up,
Plus
they
nostalgia
were
is
they were gone.
dangerous. So
Yeah, yeah, but I can't even like I don't even have it to resist it. I
yeah.
just not there. So, but
I
like,
will say, pal, like whenever anybody has that, I'm like, they're forgetting all of the crap. that's my
yeah,
that's my
of
whole
course.
reaction. Like you guys are forgetting the crap. There's so much crap back then.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
mean that's just like I mean you're a wrestling fan. I'm a wrestling fan. When people talk about Attitude Era stuff,
You know how much
that's
crap was in the Attitude
like
Era?
exactly like I skipped it. which is why I have a weird perspective on it. Because I started with like Hogan stuff, and then I skipped the entire Attitude Era, and I came back like CM Punk. So
There was barely
I'm
any
weird in that
wrestling in the
sense.
Attitude Era.
Yeah, exactly. But it's so with comics, I don't have that mindset. But I think it would be fair to say that this is already, for me, in terms of quality, this is a golden era in terms
I
of
agree.
just ability of Filipino creators to put out comics of all sorts of genres. So I mean, it's there's so much. So those are the though I so a lot of people are inspirations to me, even if I can't really, unfortunately, swipe any of their stylistic abilities for my own stuff.
In 5 sentences or less, elevator pitch time. Tell us what
Yeah.
Mythspace is all about.
Uh, the one sentence elevator's pitch is Capres in space. That's what we shout at every convention. The longer version is basically Mythspace is a space opera in the vein of Star Wars, except that instead of using Western archetypes as the basis for your alien civilizations, we use Philippine folklore and mythology. It's was specifically made for us to be able to um because a lot of by the time we started doing myth space, this is already years after Transcend mythology class, a lot of people were making use of Philippine folklore and mythology in stuff like urban fantasy,
Yeah.
in stuff like straight up fantasy, but no one was doing it for
Sci-fi.
obvious reasons, I guess. Yeah, it seemed like a counterintuitive choice, but I remember because I'm a pretty big Star Wars fan, or at least I was when we were still doing, we were still neck deep in like expanded universe is canon stuff.
I
They
notice people who call themselves Star Wars fans these days don't particularly like Star Wars.
oh I still like the Star Wars now. It's just that I
Yeah.
haven't. That was when I was neck deep in it. Was like Timothy Zahn stuff, and they bring him
Yeah.
back now, and I'd love to go back to it. And but when I remember during that the heyday, I remember reading some sort of analysis of how Lucas was making his was basing his aliens, the why they made why these aliens were so somehow not really familiar but relatable,
Hmm.
or they just made it, they seem to work and on screen, was they were actually based on archetypes from Western folklore or mythology. And I was like, "Hmm, I mean, we have so much to offer on that here. That's why don't we do it that way?" Because that when Mythspace came to me, was proposed to me by Koi, and as what he did was he came to me, he said, because I previously critiqued one of his, because I used to critique comics,
Yeah.
local comics, and Koi was one of the people who responded well to the criticisms, and so we'd be talking, and then he eventually said that he had a group of friends who wanted to do a science fiction anthology, and so from the start it was going to be science fiction,
So
and
from the
he
start, it was
knew.
going to be an anthology.
Yes.
Okay.
So they came to me as a group because they wanted to work together on science fiction anthology comic, and he knew I knew a lot of other prose writers, and he said that, won't you connect us with writers who could team up with us to write the stories? And me, being the greedy bastard that I am, I said, if you don't mind, why don't I just write everything? And because I mean I one of the things that I have an issue with anthologies, I guess, is a way to put it. That in that I was always someone who liked longer form work.
Hmm.
When we were growing up, a lot of other people, their genre fiction um, exposure primarily came from short stories. There were no short stories for me when I was a kid, most of them were like epics, really huge things. And so anthologies for me, I've always seen them as a little bit of a hard sell. That's why when I did Alternative Alamat, I made sure it was a themed anthology. So there was some sort of unifying force, not just a short story collection. So I said, look, we can do it this way. I can write everything. I write fast. I'll be good. But we can also set them all in the same universe. That way, even if we divide the work, people who want to come in for something more meaty will be able to get that from the fact that everything can sort of have elements of another thing. And again, the layering. We can tell a story in this book, you can tell a story here that adds an aspect of understanding to this other story. And then if we put them all together, it will be more than the sum of its parts. And so happily they went for that. And that's how Mythspace was born.
And how did you hook up with Ablaze?
Um, Budget. It was Budget's fault.
Doc.
No, he basically. I think there was what he mentioned was that there was this there was a like I think it was CBR or one of the comic sites had after Trece came out like a list of 10 comics from the Philippines you should read or something like that, and we were I don't think they were listed in order of like which is the best, but we
Yeah.
were the last. So I guess maybe that gave the impression that we were like the top of the heap. But
On a list like that, you always want to be first, second, or last.
yeah,
Because
exactly.
after the second
So
one, people start scrolling.
right, just rolling that. And we had a picture, so
Yeah.
that worked to our benefit too. Because even 10 years ago, Koi's art was amazing. So apparently it caught the eye of Ablaze and they reached out to Butch and said, hey, could you make some introductions? So Butch had asked me and then of course I jumped at the chance. And then we got to talking and then um basically their only caveat was they wanted to make it in color, but they were already they were already saying they already had the plan that we can do it with a campaign to help fund the coloring process. So I talked it over with the team, and because at the time we were actually debating, because we had other offers as well, and we were also debating if we wanted to get an agent, that sort of thing. But in the end, we said that we saw what Ablaze had done with Trece. We liked their work,
Yeah,
and
it's good.
Budget, of course, vouched for them. And I said, let's do it. And then here we are on the eve of the campaign, and I'm sweating my ass off. But it's exciting. It was good to see the gang again. I worked with a few of them on individual projects since, but this is the first time we've all gotten back together. So
I'm gonna ask you two questions that will be worded as one question. Why do Filipino comics, actually Filipino literature in general, why do we keep going back to Filipino myth, and why don't we do sci-fi as much? What is the disconnect?
I think when it comes to the myths, that it goes into the sort of complicated relationship most of us have with Philippine identity. Like the entire like um with some other ethnicities or nationalities, the they have a very I wouldn't say homogeneous, but there's a clear party line about what that national identity should be.
Yeah.
And I gave a talk to UST a couple of years ago when I said a part of that is because in a lot of those places they have had their myths reappropriated by the state in a way that constructs identity in a certain way. Like it's very, when you have a very I mean, you know that you're from this ethnicity. Let's say you're from Greek. You have, this is your pantheon of gods from before. These are your canon of myths that were told about us before. This is what it means to be someone from to be Greek. You know, with us, we don't have that, because what the Spaniards did when they came over was they tried to stamp it all out. They weren't interested in using it. They were interested in making us, Catholic. So,
And we weren't
um,
unified even before that, right?
no, we wouldn't. We
Yeah.
weren't. So, like the entire idea of Philippine identity was, it's already constructed and in a way that isn't a natural thing. Like there was no natural um there's no natural link from between someone who lived in Luzon and someone who lived in Mindanao. It's all forced upon us. And even if at this point it's already a fait accompli, I mean, we are the Philippines. There's no getting around that. We're not suddenly going to splinter into individual islands, but it makes it, for that core element. That's one of the reasons why our sense of identity is so ambiguous, because, and that's beneficial and not beneficial. Beneficial in the sense it can make us more inclusive of what it means to be a Filipino, but at the same time, it's hard to make an elevator pitch about what it means to be a Filipino.
Mm-hmm.
So, and part of that is because we don't have that singular mythology that was imposed on us to sort of form the backbone of our cultural identity. We have a diversity of mythologies, a diversity of folklore, and that's why it's hard to teach. And that's also why it's something that a lot of us, when we get a taste of it, try to grab onto, because it sort of helps fill in the blanks of what a part of us might believe a cultural identity should be. So
Yeah.
that's why we sort of gravitated. As for science fiction, I mean, I think a lot of it I think it's a chicken and egg situation, in the sense that fantasy is easy, in the sense that our epics are fantasies. So we have representation in fantasy stories. We have representation in urban fantasy stories, just through like your ghost stories, your shake, rattle, and rolls. There's representation there. But for science fiction, there isn't, because we don't have that existing. Because science fiction was something that came after, so we're not going to have an epic from um, an indigenous community that is science fiction that puts us in the leader role. So without being able to see representation in science fiction from the Philippines, or Filipinos writing science fiction on a wide, or not necessarily global, but on a popular stage, then it's not really going to cross the mind of a young writer um, to write science fiction. It just it's a blind spot, because there isn't enough science fiction by Filipinos or featuring Filipinos that's out there. So that's one of the reasons we made this space.
It's a prime opportunity. It's a white space. White
It's
space.
yeah.
Okay.
The thing that I always say when people ask me what my motivation is for writing is, it's always, my writing was always meant, like, it's like my writing was always meant to fill an absence. Um, I want to see more Filipinos writing, more Filipinos for Filipinos in more Filipino settings used or inspiring the kind of stories that I love to read. I love to read science fiction. I love to read space opera. There wasn't a lot. There was hardly any at the time that when we made Mythspace. There was hardly any Filipino science fiction comics out there. So Mythspace was made as a way to help fill that hole. Um, when I made Alternative Alamat, it was the same thing. When we made Muros, it was the same thing. Um, that's always what I've been trying to do. Is I mean, I might not be the best at that particular genre, or that might not be the best writer, but that doesn't matter as far as my motivation goes. My motivation is these are the kind of stories that I think we need to see more of. These are the kind of stories that I like. I will make stories in that genre.
And if it inspires other people to do the same thing, then you've won.
Right. And if it inspires them to do better than I did because they think it wasn't, yeah,
Then you've really won.
yeah, great. Then I can read your stuff, and I'll be happy. I'll be happy as a reader, and I'll still make stuff anyway. Um, so it it's trying to break out of that cycle.
But
It's trying to make things visible.
but wow, doesn't the leading literature awards body of the Philippines say that science fiction and fantasy are not literature and art?
Oh, no, they just said that it's not literate. It's not something that can push the boundaries or elevate art. So
I never understood this, right? I never understood this because I'm like, if I were an artist, I would imagine that painting something that I can already see is easier than painting something I cannot see. You know what I
but
mean?
then they can't tell you you did it wrong. They
Oh,
can't go,
yes. Okay,
look
yeah.
at this vase. It's not a vase. You know,
All right.
That-
I'm gonna go through the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5 stories that you six. Is it six?
six.
It's the 6 stories that you
Yeah.
have. And I want you to tell me about them and working with the artist, the particular artist of that story, and what it's like to see their art getting remastered. So
Mm.
let's start with Liftoff.
Well, Koi is like he is the one that was the impetuous for the entire Mythspace franchise, so to speak. And Koi's art has always been for me just flat out amazing. I've always loved seeing it. But Koi's art even before, even 10 years ago, and like 10 years is the space of time between this year when this is coming out and when we started the first Ashcan of Mythspace.
I remember that one.
So, so 10 years ago, his art was already better in color. It's just that because of the limitations of everything, there was no way, time wise, we could do a fully colored version of Mythspace and publish it here. No one was publishing colored stuff at the time, and we just didn't have the time for it. We barely made our deadlines from convention to convention. So, but now seeing it after 10 years of improvement, because um, he's been drawing constantly since then, and like you can see just how the talent has been honed by practice over the years, and to see his stuff, to see that his version of Lift Off in color now is it's amazing. It's something that I can proudly say, you could put it beside, well, I could say that even before, but now, since with the addition of color, you can put it beside any other comic out there on any store, and I will be proud to have it next to, I will say that's the same league. um so Lift Off is our anchor story. It's the one that gives you your viewpoint character. It's the most um traditional in that sense story, because it's the portal fantasy.
Mhm.
So it allows us to have someone who does not know about this wider universe and to sort of experience and learn about it along with the reader. It involves it's a young adult coming of age story involving someone who thought that his Lola's stories about space capres and robot bungisnis are just made up, and for him to discover after his Lola has died that these were all true, it's a shock to him, because it also means that her stories about his parents being kidnapped rather than just killed in a car accident are probably true as well. So his reaction to being placed in a situation where he enters this brand new world, it's not trepidation, it's excitement, because this is his chance to find out the truth. And that sort of attitude is what drives him through the rest of that story, and allows us to sort of do a mini sightseeing tour of the other races involved here, the kind of galactic politics that are they're going to have to deal with, and that provides a great standalone adventure, but also a great entry point for all the other stories in the book.
That is Liftoff with Koy Carrion. What about Black Mark with Paul Quiroga?
Black Mark is our story that focuses on the Nuno. Um, the Nuno are I sort of combined the ideas for Nuno and Duende into one. And one of the world building things about that you get from the stories about the Duende is how they're supposed to come in different colors, and each color has a different like there's the good ones, the bad ones. They each the colors matter, and I sort of transposed that to political factions for that story, so that each Nuno, when they're old enough, they will tint their skin with the color of their faction. So
How dare you make comics political, Paolo?
yeah, well, well, one of my no, I don't think Asterix was political, but I found it political when I
I
was a
think
kid.
it was. Yeah.
I think eventually that was one of my first. I mean, even before I started the superhero stuff, my first comics were Peanuts and Asterix. So
I think
I guess
Asterix
that
definitely was. Like, because it was always commenting on something about the monarchy.
I guess I missed those levels because I wouldn't know what French monarchy was like.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Black Mark was working with Paul, and basically all of the stories of Mythspace. What we did was when we first got together in Cafe Bola, uh, was we did it like a speed dating thing. That I'd sit in front of each of them, feeling so in demand because I was the only writer. And I would ask them, okay, what do you want to do? Like, you want to do science fiction, but like, what what genres would you enjoy? And Paul's was he wanted something to do with mecha. So that was why we constructed the race of Nuno to involve riding giant mechas
Mm.
and after the Bungis. So Black Mark, but Paul doesn't say much, but he's very dynamic when it comes to his art, and we really did a lot of back and forth with just like because a lot of the other artists they were coming into it not as adept at drawing machinery as some of the others, but Paul was very very good with the mix. So that what became the focus of the book, and that's the focus of that story was how basically it's a sort of Suicide Squad sort of thing, um, involving like a group of a group of non-aligned Nuno who are just there to get the job done when all the political infighting paralyzes the government. So that's what basically Black Mark is. It's like a Suicide Squad adventure with mechs.
What about Devourers of Light with Jules Gregorio?
Devourers was our that's our war story. We talked that what Jules wanted to do. That his genre. He wanted to do something with a war. Not to make it seem like he's like a bloodthirsty person. Jules is great. He's very nice. Um, he, but that's what he wanted to do. And of all the artists, Jules is the one who's had the easiest time transitioning to colored because he originally did Devourers painted. Like we just made it grayscale, but that was his art style even before. So that's why a lot of what we that's why a lot of the pages in the Devourers are laid out as double page spreads, was just to give his art like this expansive feel, because that's how he painted them. And I mean, seeing them painted seeing them in color, it's more like seeing them how they were always meant to be. So like, not all of the artists are redrawing their artwork for the colored edition. Everyone's coloring it, but not everyone is actually redrawing the artwork. Jules is one of the ones who I don't think is going to redraw it. It's just going to be, he's going to put the colors back in.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's for him, it's like, that's how it is always meant to be. So it's good to finally see it that way.
Uncommon Ground with Miko Dimagiba.
Yeah, Uncommon was one of the hardest to make, because Miko wanted to do a detective story.
That's
I was like,
hard in comics, isn't it?
and it's science fiction. So I
Yeah.
was like, but okay, fine, let's just do it. So what we did with that was, we decided we'd focus, because what happened was, everybody got a specific genre that they wanted, and we tried to make sure there wasn't as much of an overlap, and then everyone got a particular race to focus on. So we have except for Koi, because that was the lead story. So with Paul, he got the Nuno. With Jules, he got the Laho, or the Bakunawa. And with Miko, even if his involves a Capre and a Laho as well, the driving point for the mystery in that story was that he was dealing with the race of shapeshifters called the Taiho, which is basically like, if you read Philippine folklore, like, their go-to superpower is shapeshifting. Like, almost every folklore creature or monster has shapeshifting in its kit. So what I did was try to combine these into a race of shapeshifters with different favored forms. So I put the tikbalang there, I put the ikugan there, I put the sigbin there, all of whom have in stories exhibited shape-shifting powers. So I sort of put them all together there, sort of as also a way of avoiding the usual science fiction pitfall of having a single race be monolithic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, all the sand people are just like this. All the Mon Calamari just look like this. So at least here, with the have a group of shapeshifters, we could further explore differences within the race itself. So yeah, so Mikos has been a hell of a surprise, in the sense that um his art originally was the one that was he I don't know if he just used pencil, but it appeared to me like sketches, his artwork in the original Mythspace. But now so I was wondering what he would do for the colorization process, but he's basically redrawn it, and it's really, really good. Like, the way that I can't even imagine I can't even, I mean, I like how it looked before, but I can never go back there after seeing the way he's rendered them now. It's very clean. It's not sketchy at all. It's very clean. It's very the way he's able to make variations in expression on alien features is really, really good. So, which is great for a story which involves a lot of facial cues and um emotions. So if he can make a lizard look depressed, then he's good.
What about Humanity with CR Chua?
Christina, Humanity. Christina is such a joy to work with. Partly because I like teasing her a lot. Uh, we she's my collaborator with Sparrow's Roar as well. So we always joke about how she enjoys killing off characters, which is only half a joke. But it's it's always a joy to work with her, and um like she always will wins when it comes to drawing something that she's not used to. Like in this case, like spaceships were like her bane. So we had to do a lot of back and forth with that. But she always comes through in the end. And um she's was able to, because she's redrawing hers as well. She was able to make, because one of the things that people used to like about Humanity when it first came out was her art style was very different from everything else. It was very, there was a softness to it, even if the story was about hardship. It contrasted well with the way she used all of the blacks and the curves and the softness overall. And she's managed to sharpen that up while retaining a lot of that appeal, because as it was before, it would have been hard to color, but now she's able to find a style that is able to integrate the positive aspects from her original artwork but add color to it, which is great. So the humanity's story is about, well, humanity, the spoiler alert, but it's about humanity's place in the galactic cosmos, where humanity is seen as slaves with no rights. So it's was my way of trying to explore um what to sort of make to sort of try to imagine what your typical human situation is here and compare it with what a human with power in this galaxy would look like, and sort of what would happen if these two groups would meet. So that's why even if humanity is like the title that gives away the most, it also is the title that's most fitting for the story among all of them. So
And finally, the unfurling of wings with Borg Cinnabon.
yeah, well, but Borge Unfurling was our young adult ensemble cast heist genre, because that's what Borge wanted. He wanted he wanted a heist, so which is again hard to plan out. But um it's also one of the more lore heavy stories, because his race was the Tangal, the Manananggal equivalent, which of all the races I think we put the most world building into, um because our explanation, because we knew we'd have to find a plausible explanation for why they could split their parts of their bodies. And I think what we ended up doing with the parasitical hive mind stuff was really good and really fun to sort of see to sort of speculate now, okay, if this is true, then this would be cool to do later on. So like of all the stories, I think this one had the most, except for Liftoff, this one would have the most seeds for stuff we're gonna explore later on if we get there. And it was just fun to do a heist story with the Manananggal's arm going inside a vault and stealing something with a remote camera. So Barge is a pleasure to work with. He's the only one of us who has a National Book Award. The bastard, since we all we got was a nomination. Um, but yeah, his work with those Pilanda comics were great. His work with Mythspace was great. He's my collaborator for Muros, and he's also great there. He also is one of the most vocal when it comes to ideas. So someday I'm pretty sure he won't need me anymore, and he'll be doing his writer artist stuff by himself. But for but because his art style is very clean, he's one of the people who I don't think he's going to make any major changes to his artwork, because it was very easy to just layer in the color. But it's good to see it, because the the setting where his story takes place and all the characters involved, they're very colorful. So it being able to see it like this is very much a boon to the story. So
Okay. Now, when this goes live, your Kickstarter will have been up for a couple of days. Can
mhm.
you walk us through the different tiers that you have and what rewards you'll be giving? as well as
Ah,
some of the stretch goals if you've had those thought out. And also, how does that work for shipping to the Philippines or any other country?
right. Well, let me just check. Um, for the tiers, where is it? Uh, they're basically Mythspace will be available in four different ways. It will be available digitally. It will be available paperback, hardbound, and hardbound with a shiny foil dust jacket hardcover. So the digital edition, the tier will be $12. Um, and then all the physical editions will have the digital one included, as is tradition by now. The paperback one will be $20 plus shipping. The hard copy one, hardbound, will be $30 in shipping, and the foil dust jacket one will be $45 plus shipping. Shipping is something that we'll have to play by ear. Ablaze is handling it themselves, so they have their own partners for it. So this isn't something we're using backer kit for. So, but with they have some initial shipping estimates, but I think it would be best to check back on that
Okay.
uh, as we go along, since that with the situation in Europe and everything and fuel prices, I don't know how it will affect things, but I am trying to um, talk to them to see if we can put some additional potential add-on books from them, like other books that makes maybe that we can add as possible add-ons, just so that people can combine them in terms of making the shipping charge more of a deal than it otherwise would be. So what else do you have? The fifth tier would be everything above. So those are the four tiers, and your highest is the foil dust jacket hardcover one. So all the tiers above that, the copy will be the foil dust jacket edition. So for $75, you get the one with uh signed copies, basically. Although we still don't know if we're just gonna probably we're gonna sign something and we'll send that, like a signature card or a bookplate, something like that, and we'll send that to Ablaze rather than them having them ship all the books here, signing them and shipping it back to them for shipping out, which just wouldn't work. Um, tier six would be the remarked version of the signature card. So that would be the ones with. I actually had heard the term before I started researching it for the campaign. It's the one with the where people like do these little sketches,
Mhm.
and actually, if people had the the fortune of um coming to the conventions where one of the artists was also there. We used to do that for almost all of the copies too. We would like put those little drawings there. Nobody wanted my drawings for some reason. So we also have a few retailer shipping bundles. So I'll just skip over those. And then we have at the $400 tier is the limited two special mythical cameos. It's the one where you want to have yourself drawn into the book. Except this is limited partly because there aren't a lot of humans in our books. So the positions where we could put in a cameo are very few. So we're just limiting it at two. I mean, unless if somebody wants to be a have a horse head, that'll work for me. It's just that you won't really be able to brag about it to your friends unless you actually look like a horse, which is pretty sad. I hope that's not the case, but you would take your $400 for that anyway. Um, and the highest tier we have is basically the $500 the payload edition, which is basically um it comes with an original sketch. It comes with 6 art prints. Because right now we're all of the artists are making an art print each. Some of them will be new editions of old art. Some will be totally new. It'll have 6 remark cards. That's 6 signature cards with the signatures, with the doodles. I'll even doodle one for you for free. Um, and then it has the option for having, aside from being listed as a primary backer in the page of the book, you also have a option to do a Q&A with someone from the team, which could be me or it could be somebody else. So this is just for if you really want to have everything possible, and maybe talk to us personally as well. So I don't know if talking to me is worth $500, but there. So those are most of our tiers. We might open more as the campaign goes by. The funding goal we've set is $6,000. um, we've decided to be moderate in our expectations, and partly because we want, like, if we are able to breach it, we have stretch goals at the ready for that. So I just want to make it clear that Ablaze has acquired Mythspace Ignition, so even if the worst happens and we don't get funded, it will come out. It's just that, like, I've been trying to sort of explain it to people who aren't familiar with the way advances in the comic industry sort of work, that you don't get all this money at the very start. Usually you usually have to, if there's work to be done in the comic, it comes in segments when you hit certain milestone goals and everything. But given that most of the artists on the team have to do other paying work, it the only way that we can get this done quick and with enough leeway to sort of not cram it, not enter into crunch time, is if we're able to get the lion's share of that money, or even all of it, up front. And the only way we can do that is through the campaign. So that this is basically our way of making sure that the team has the funds to be able to say no to other paying work for X number of months, so that they can just be focused on Mythspace for that time.
Got it. Okay, pal. Thank you for this interview. I have one last question as we wrap up.
Okay.
I know you're a child of the 80s. I know you like, this whole comic is about, Filipino myth and science fiction. One last question. Is 3030 from Brave Star Atikbalang?
Well, he's not a centaur, that's for sure. I don't think he's mischievous enough.
Oh,
He's kind of got to stick up his ass. So
he does. He does. Thank you so much, pal. Good luck
thank you,
with
Duy. It
good
was a
luck with
pleasure.
Kickstarter.
Thank you. We will need it.